Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
At my brother's birthday dinner, my dad raised his glass, locked eyes with me across the white linen table, and with that smug little grin that had haunted me since childhood, said, "He's the son we're proud of. Not everyone can be a winner." The table erupted in polite laughter. I smiled like I was in on the joke, like the jab hadn't landed right in the center of my chest. And while everyone else lifted their glasses and toasted the golden boy, I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick manila folder. I slid it slowly across the table, the silence chasing it like a wave of unease. And when my dad opened it, when he saw what was inside, his hand froze mid-page, and my mother, sweet, perfect Lorna Wolfe, who'd mastered the art of denial, dropped her fork like it burned her fingers. But let me back up, because that moment didn't come out of nowhere. And if I'm being honest, I didn't just wake up that morning thinking I'd blow up 4 decades of family dysfunction over tiramisu and sparkling rosé. This dinner, this moment, this carefully calculated unveiling, it had been brewing for years, maybe even since I was a kid counting the cracks in the ceiling during another one of Dad's speeches about winners and losers, while Dany, his perfect son, got another pass for forgetting his chores or crashing Mom's car. The truth is, there's a moment in every neglected kid's life when they stop asking for approval and start planning the exit. I just took my sweet time about it. The dinner itself was one of those obnoxious suburban affairs meant to look casual but screamed money from every square inch of the place. We were at a restaurant downtown, La Piazza or something equally pretentious, with waiters in black vests pouring wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and a view of the riverfront that made the city sparkle like it wasn't built on broken unions and unpaid mortgages. My brother Dany had just turned 38 and was holding court at the head of the table like a politician mid-campaign, shaking hands, telling stories, modest laughing every time someone complimented his latest philanthropic venture. Of course, nobody brought up the fact that most of what he did with his nonprofit looked suspiciously like PR disguised as charity. But who was I to ruin a good story? Mom was in her usual role, wearing a tight smile and a pastel cardigan, sipping from her wine glass just enough to take the edge off, but not enough to miss a single detail she could use later when rehashing the evening with her book club. Dad sat across from me, looking relaxed in that way men do when they've never had to question their position at the center of the family universe. And me? I was placed at the far end of the table like an afterthought, next to Dany's fiancée, a woman named Bree who had the voice of a kindergarten teacher and the emotional depth of a puddle. She leaned toward me early in the evening, all pink lip gloss and earnest eyes, and said, "Your dad told me you write online now. That must be so freeing, like following your passion, right?" I smiled, nodded, and didn't bother correcting her. She didn't need to know that I'd built and sold a consulting firm 2 years ago, or that I worked remote with 6-figure contracts while she was still figuring out which candle scent best matched her personal brand. As the wine flowed and the stories grew more exaggerated, the toast loomed like a storm cloud. I could feel building with every word out of my father's mouth. I knew it was coming. I could see the way he glanced at his glass, then at Dany, then at me, just to make sure I was watching. It was always about control with him, the performance, the hierarchy, and when he finally stood and raised his glass, clearing his throat in that way that said, "Pay attention, I'm about to speak truth," I knew exactly what he was going to say before he said it. "To my son," he began, placing a proud hand on Dany's shoulder, "the one who's made us proud, who took what we gave him and turned it into something real. Not everyone can be a winner, but tonight we celebrate the one who is." I laughed, quietly but enough for him to hear. That's when I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder, the one I'd been preparing for months, the one that held bank statements, business filings, emails, and enough evidence to burn a bridge so thoroughly even the ashes wouldn't recognize where they came from. I didn't say a word, just slid it forward like I was offering dessert, and watched as my father's eyes landed on the first page. The confident smirk drained from his face like a faucet turned off. He flipped the next page, and the next. I could see the recognition dawn in his eyes, not just that he was caught, but that I'd known for a very long time exactly who he was, and I had finally decided to stop pretending I didn't. Across the table, Dany leaned in, squinting at the documents. "What is this?" he asked, his voice still casual, but with a thread of tension pulling tight underneath. My dad didn't answer. My mom blinked slowly, her lips parting slightly as her eyes scanned the pages. Then she dropped her fork, and for the first time in my life, I saw her facade crack wide open. She looked at me, not like I was her daughter, but like I was a stranger, holding a lit match in a room full of gasoline. And maybe I wasn't. I didn't need to say anything else. The folder said it all, but still, I looked my father in the eye, held that stare as long as he could stand it, and then said, "Calm as you please. I thought we should all be on the same page tonight." Then I sat back, sipped my wine, and waited for the implosion. People think family dynamics are born out of love and discipline and shared values. But what they don't tell you, what nobody really wants to admit, is that more often than not, those dynamics are built on favoritism, on unspoken expectations, on the roles you get shoved into when you're too young to understand what they mean, and far too loyal to question them. I spent my entire childhood living in the long golden shadow of my brother Dany, a place so comfortable for everyone else and so suffocating for me that even now, years later, I still find myself ducking in conversations like I expect his name to come crashing through the ceiling. From the time we were kids, it was clear. Dany was the one they were waiting for, and I was just the one who showed up first. Dany was the kind of kid who could get away with murder as long as he flashed that charming little smile that made every adult in the room laugh like he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. He wasn't mean, not directly anyway. He just existed in the strange, frictionless space where everything seemed to work out for him, and everyone bent a little to make sure it stayed that way. When we were little, he'd forget his homework, and I'd get scolded for not reminding him. He'd spill juice on the carpet, and I'd be the one scrubbing it out while Mom cooed at him that accidents happen. The message was subtle, but it came through loud and clear. Dany was special, and I was responsible. For him, for the house, for making things run smooth so he could shine. I remember once in 4th grade, I got straight A's on my report card. I brought it home, heart pounding, expecting something, anything. Praise, a smile, maybe one of Dad's rare nods of approval. Instead, he glanced at the paper, muttered something about me being bookish, and then turned right around and asked Dany how soccer practice went. That night at dinner, while I sat quietly eating spaghetti, he went on and on about Dany's game-winning goal like it was a national achievement. No one asked me how school was. No one asked me anything. That was how it always was. Dany's first real accomplishment came in high school, when he got cast as the lead in some over-the-top musical. He couldn't sing, not really, but he had presence, charisma, whatever it was people always said he had. I, meanwhile, was working part-time after school and applying to colleges in secret because I knew better than to ask for help. I got into the University of Michigan on a scholarship, something I'd worked for tirelessly. And when I told my parents, my father actually said, "That's great, sweetheart. But we'll have to see what Dany decides to do. He might need the car if he stays local." That sentence, casual, thoughtless, crushing, lodged itself somewhere deep in my gut and just stayed there, a knot I never managed to untie. The worst part wasn't just the favoritism, it was the gaslighting that came with it. Every time I brought it up, even gently, I was told I was too sensitive, that I was imagining things, that I shouldn't be jealous of my brother because he had different struggles. And maybe he did. Maybe there were pressures I didn't see, but I was never allowed to have mine. Mine didn't matter. I was the smart one, the dependable one, the quiet one who didn't need the spotlight because she had potential. That word, potential, was just another way of saying, we expect you to do everything with nothing and expect no credit when you pull it off. And I did. I pulled it off, over and over again. I worked 2 jobs in college. I lived in a studio apartment with no heat and a roommate who once stole my winter coat. I finished my degree while tutoring other students for $10 an hour. I didn't ask for help. I didn't go home for holidays. I stopped calling after my dad once asked me, on the phone, if I was still chasing that degree thing. When I finally graduated, I sent the announcement in the mail like a formality. They didn't come. They said they couldn't miss Dany's baseball game. As adults, the distance didn't close. It just got quieter. Dany became the family success story. Started his own nonprofit, made local news for a Clean Up the Parks campaign, married a woman who looked like she walked out of a catalog. I started my own business and worked in silence, building something real, something mine. But whenever I showed up to family dinners, I was still introduced as Jenna, our little writer, like my entire career was a hobby I refused to outgrow. It was infuriating. It was humiliating. And yet I swallowed it year after year because there was no room for me to be angry. I was the peacekeeper, the one who didn't make waves. That illusion finally cracked 2 years ago when I had coffee with a former classmate who happened to mention Dany's nonprofit. How great it was, how innovative, and how smart it was that he'd taken inspiration from my blog. I didn't understand at first. I asked her what she meant, and she pulled out her phone and showed me. There it was, word for word, an entire program model I'd developed in a post from 3 years ago. One I'd written about trauma-informed mentorship for at-risk youth, lifted and repackaged as Dany's own initiative. My heart dropped. I remember nodding along like it was no big deal, but something inside me shifted in that moment. It wasn't just the theft, it was that it didn't even surprise me. Later that night, I brought it up to my parents, casually, just to gauge the reaction. My mother blinked, smiled, and said something about how ideas are meant to be shared in families. My father just chuckled and said, "Well, Dany's always been good at seeing potential and making it real." That was when I knew they didn't just overlook me. They discounted me completely. In their minds, I didn't exist in the same world of possibility. I was a footnote, a support beam, useful, invisible, replaceable. I could have let it go. I'd done it before. But something about that moment made me pause. For the first time, I looked at the situation not just as a pattern, but as a structure, a carefully preserved system where my role was designed to hold up someone else's legacy. I thought about every job I didn't apply for because I didn't think I was good enough. Every time I downplayed my own work to avoid sounding arrogant. Every minute I spent minimizing myself to make others comfortable. And I realized I'd been complicit in my own erasure. So I started digging, not because I wanted revenge, at least not then, but because I wanted clarity. I wanted to see if what I felt was real, if what I suspected had weight. I started tracing timelines, looking into Dany's nonprofit, tracking overlaps between my blog content and their programming. What I found didn't just confirm my instincts, it pointed to something darker, something deliberate. But that's getting ahead of the story. What matters here is that long before I slid that folder across the table, long before my dad lifted his glass and made that toast that he probably thought was clever, I had already begun the process of tearing down the myth of Dany Wolfe. And the first brick in that wall was realizing that just because someone shines doesn't mean they aren't standing on top of someone else's back to do it. There's a kind of quiet you learn to live with when you grow up in a house where being overlooked becomes the norm. Not because you're invisible in the literal sense, but because every part of who you are, everything you accomplish, and all the ways you hold yourself together when no one else seems to notice or care, are silently categorized as expected, unremarkable, or somehow not enough. For me, that quiet didn't end when I moved out at 19, and it didn't change the moment I got my first paycheck or paid my first rent on time without a co-signer or anyone there to pick up the pieces when things inevitably went sideways. If anything, the silence grew louder because now it had the space to echo, and still I made peace with it. Because at some point, you either become bitter enough to burn down everything behind you, or patient enough to let the fire come to you when it's ready. I left home without fanfare, without a suitcase full of dreams or a clear plan, just a backpack of clothes, a box of notebooks, and the kind of heavy exhaustion that comes from constantly existing in the background of your own life. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody even asked where I was going. My father, absorbed in some business deal and already deep in plans for Dany's future, waved me off like I was going on a weekend trip instead of leaving for good. My mother gave me that tight-lipped smile she always reserved for things she didn't want to deal with, like traffic tickets or emotional conversations, and said, "Call when you get settled." I never did. And for a while, I told myself that was my choice, that I didn't want them involved, that I didn't need them. But the truth is, I didn't think they'd care enough to pick up the phone if I did. Over the next several years, I learned how to survive without support. I worked shifts at a diner where the grease never quite washed out of your hair, took night classes at the community college because they were cheaper, and poured myself into freelance writing jobs that paid barely enough to cover groceries, but gave me a kind of freedom I'd never known. I slept on couches, in borrowed bedrooms, once even in the backseat of a friend's car when rent fell through and my last paycheck was delayed. No one from my family reached out. No one asked how I was doing. Occasionally, my mother would forward some family newsletter or invite to a cousin's baby shower, but there was never a note, never a question, never a sign that my life mattered to them outside of its function in their narrative. Somewhere between the exhaustion and the late-night writing sessions that blurred into sunrise, I built something. It wasn't flashy or traditional, and it didn't come with a neat job title that my parents could brag about over golf or book club. But it was mine. I started a consulting agency that focused on communication strategies for nonprofits. Quiet work, behind-the-scenes work, the kind that most people never see, but without which a lot of big missions fall apart. I kept it small at first, worked remotely, built relationships carefully and deliberately, and eventually, without meaning to, I became successful. Not magazine cover successful, not TED Talk successful, but steady client, self-employed, financially stable, able to say no to assholes successful. I was doing work that mattered, on my own terms, and I wasn't asking for approval anymore. At least, that's what I told myself. And yet, every time I went home for a holiday or a birthday, or one of those obligatory family dinners where everyone wears nice shoes and pretends nothing's broken, I found myself back in the same role, Jenna, the quirky older sister with her little writing gig, who still hadn't settled down, who liked her independence, as if that was a euphemism for being unfinished or unchosen. Dany, meanwhile, would arrive late, kiss everyone on the cheek, tell a few polished stories about his nonprofit's latest achievements, and bask in the applause like he'd just cured cancer instead of hiring a PR team to make his volunteer events look like movements. My father never asked what I was working on. My mother occasionally mentioned she still hadn't quite figured out what I did. And Dany's fiancé once patted my hand during dinner and said, "I think it's great that you're still figuring things out. We all move at our own pace." I smiled, said thank you, and excused myself to the bathroom, where I stared at my reflection and counted to 50 just to stop myself from screaming. What finally pushed me over the edge wasn't the comments or the dismissals. It was the realization that my father hadn't just stolen my voice metaphorically by constantly ignoring it, but literally, financially, and publicly. When I discovered that Dany's flagship program, the one getting media attention, corporate sponsorships, and accolades from local politicians, was not only conceptually lifted from an article I had written and quietly published years ago, but was being funded through a grant that listed my social security number as a silent partner. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, maybe some clerical error. Maybe Dany had meant to list me as a contributor, or someone had confused us, or some administrative assistant had typed the wrong number. But as I dug deeper, piecing together digital paper trails and comparing dates and signatures, it became clear. My father had used my information without my permission. He had done it intentionally and worse. He'd done it with the confidence of someone who knew I wouldn't find out, or if I did, wouldn't have the guts to do anything about it. I remember sitting alone in my apartment after finding the final confirmation, an email from a board member thanking Don Wolf for sourcing such an innovative framework, and mentioning his daughter Jenna in passing like I was a footnote in someone else's speech. I sat there for hours, laptop open, wine glass untouched, heart pounding in that cold, detached way that feels less like rage and more like something breaking clean in half. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just opened a blank document and started writing. Not a blog post, not an email, a plan, because the thing about being invisible your whole life is that it teaches you to watch, to listen, to gather. People underestimate what they can't see. They reveal themselves freely when they think you're not really there. And I had been gathering things for years. Documents, timelines, receipts, memories sharpened into weapons. Not because I wanted to use them, but because some part of me, deep down, knew the day would come when I'd have no choice but to stop smiling and finally set the record straight. That day was closer than any of them realized. There's something oddly empowering about realizing, finally and without denial, that you're the villain in someone else's fairy tale, especially when that someone is a man who spent his entire life molding reality around himself so tightly that even those closest to him can't distinguish the fiction from the truth anymore. Once I crossed the threshold from confusion into clarity. Once I accepted, not with bitterness, but with a kind of cool precision, that my father had not simply forgotten me, but had actively chosen to sideline, exploit, and erase me, I felt an eerie calm descend over everything. It was the calm of someone who no longer hoped for reconciliation, no longer craved acknowledgement, and who no longer carried the weight of waiting for justice to arrive. From someone else's hands, I had been overlooked, discredited, and used, yes, but I had also been underestimated. And that, I knew, was the fatal miscalculation that was about to cost my father everything he believed he controlled. In the weeks that followed the discovery of my stolen program, my identity linked to funds I had never seen and initiatives I had never been invited to speak on, I began a process that, if I'm being honest, felt less like planning revenge and more like finally telling the truth in a language my family would understand. Paper, signatures, numbers, facts that couldn't be gaslit into irrelevance or dismissed as overreactions. I started with public records, combing through nonprofit filings, comparing the financial reports of Dany's organization with my own documents, and finding more than enough irregularities to justify suspicion. There were donation totals that didn't match grant reports, service hours inflated across multiple locations that didn't exist, and partner programs listed that were nothing more than ghost entities registered under vague names tied back to shell companies. Shell companies, as it turned out, created by none other than my father through one of his lesser-known consulting firms, a name I only recognized because it had appeared briefly in one of my own clients' rejected partnership audits the year before. The moment I made that connection, the undeniable link between my father's private investments and the nonprofit my brother was parading around town as a philanthropic triumph, I knew I wasn't dealing with carelessness or a one-time lapse in ethics. This was a system, a structure designed to funnel money, dodge oversight, and trade on good intentions to create personal profit. And whether Dany understood the full extent of it or not, he was complicit. He was the face, the voice, the wholesome, all-American hero, building community playgrounds and taking photos with politicians, while my father moved money behind the curtain, using my name when it suited him, and never once offering credit, let alone consent. I hired a forensic accountant, someone who didn't know me personally, but who owed a favor to one of my clients and agreed to keep things quiet, for now. We met in coffee shops, exchanged encrypted emails, and slowly pieced together a timeline that proved, beyond speculation, that my father had used my social security number to secure at least 2 separate funding streams that had since been diverted into a mix of administrative accounts and consulting fees that somehow all pointed back to him. It wasn't criminal yet, but it was unethical, and if made public, it would shatter the reputation he'd spent a lifetime cultivating, especially since he'd paraded around his integrity like a badge of honor at every social club, fundraiser, and board meeting since the 90s. The irony was almost poetic, but I wasn't satisfied with exposure alone. I didn't want to just burn the structure down. I wanted to make sure everyone saw who built it and how, and I wanted them to look at me differently afterward. Not with pity or condescension, but with the kind of stunned respect you give someone who you didn't realize was playing chess while you were still sorting your checkers. So I crafted my approach carefully. I began to show up again, just a little more than usual, just enough to remind them I existed. I attended a family dinner I would have normally skipped, laughed at my mother's passive-aggressive comments about my unusual work schedule, and smiled through one of Dany's long-winded stories about his impact partners, while quietly memorizing names and details to fact-check later. I played my role flawlessly, the agreeable, detached daughter who didn't mind being the punchline, all while I watched, gathered, planned. Then I called Bree, Dany's fiancée, and invited her to lunch. She was suspicious at first, but curiosity won out, and we met at a small cafe near the lake. I kept it light, talked about wedding plans, admired her ring, asked polite questions about their future, and eventually I mentioned, with a casual shrug, how I'd been thinking of donating to Dany's nonprofit in honor of our parents' anniversary. She lit up, gushed about how meaningful that would be, and then she said something that confirmed what I already suspected. Don says it's the best thing Dany's ever done. He says they're building a legacy together. She meant it as praise, but to me, it was the final puzzle piece. My father wasn't just helping Dany. He was embedding himself in the narrative, solidifying his place in the Wolf family story, not just as a father, but as a quiet architect of something bigger. And he thought no one would ever notice. In the days leading up to Dany's birthday dinner, I made one last move. I printed everything: financial records, emails, LLC documents, scanned grant forms with my name on them, charts the accountant had color-coded to show the money trails, and I organized it all in a thick manila folder, carefully labeled, paginated, and protected in clear sleeves. I didn't make copies, not yet. I wanted the impact of the originals, of paper in hand, of the physical weight of what they had done and what I had found. But I did send one encrypted backup to a reporter I'd met once at a media strategy seminar, someone who specialized in nonprofit oversight and who owed me a small but important favor. I told her not to run anything unless she heard from me after the weekend. She agreed. I gave her the summary. She didn't ask many questions. She didn't have to. Finally, the night of the dinner arrived. I dressed carefully, not like I was going to war, but like I had already won. A simple black dress, a sharp jacket, heels that clicked purposefully on the restaurant floor. I arrived early, requested a specific seat at the table, directly across from my father, and waited as the others trickled in. Dany was radiant, his usual charming self, soaking in the attention like it was oxygen. My mother gave me a once-over and said I looked sleek, which was her way of acknowledging effort without approving of it. My father kissed my cheek absently and asked how my little projects were going. I smiled and said, "You'll find out soon enough." And then, as the waiter poured the wine and Dany began thanking everyone for coming, my father cleared his throat, lifted his glass, and launched into that speech. So familiar, so mug, so rehearsed. "He's the son we're proud of," he said, raising his glass, eyes twinkling with unearned satisfaction. "Not everyone can be a winner." I didn't flinch. I didn't laugh. I reached into my purse, pulled out the folder, and slid it across the table, slow and steady, until it landed directly in front of him. For a moment, no one moved. The table stilled like the air before a storm, and then he opened it. But that was just the beginning. For a moment after he opened the folder, there was no sound except the soft clink of a fork slipping from my mother's hand and the distant hum of a string quartet playing something light and forgettable in the corner of the restaurant, music that, in any other context, might have felt charming or elegant, but in that moment only added to the surreal tension building across the table like a storm front. Heavy and full of electricity. My father sat frozen, eyes moving slowly over the contents, lips pressed into a line so tight it drained the color from his face. And as he turned each page, first with mild confusion, then with growing understanding, and finally with unmistakable dread. The performance began to unravel. It didn't happen all at once. It started with a slight tightening of his jaw, followed by a twitch in his temple, and then that sharp inhale he always took when he realized he'd lost control of a conversation he thought he was leading. My brother, seated next to him and still half smiling from the toast, leaned in to glance at the documents, but his grin faltered the second he saw the words "unauthorized use of personal identification" stamped across the third page in red. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. For once, silence was the most powerful tool I had, and I let it stretch out like a rope around their necks. My mother, God bless her, reached for her wine glass with trembling fingers, her eyes darting between me and the growing pile of damning evidence, and I could see it happening in real time. The way her brain tried to rationalize what she was seeing, to rewrite the narrative, to find some version of this moment where I was still the unstable one, still the problem, still the one who had misunderstood everything. But no amount of mental gymnastics could undo the reality spelled out in black and white before her, in statements and signatures and emails copied and highlighted and numbered for clarity. There were no misunderstandings. There was no exaggeration, just truth, served cold and unflinching. Dany, to his credit, was the first to speak, though his voice lacked its usual polish, and his words came slower than usual, weighed down by disbelief. What is all this?" he asked, flipping through the folder with increasing agitation, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. "Is this some kind of joke? This isn't real, right?" His eyes darted to our father, searching for reassurance, for that familiar smirk or dismissive shrug, but it never came. Don Wolfe, confident patriarch, untouchable businessman, lifelong dealer in other people's silence, was quiet. He closed the folder slowly, placed his hand over it like a man trying to steady something fragile, and when he looked at me, his eyes held something I'd never seen before, not anger, not disappointment, not even shame, but fear, real human fear. "I told you," I said finally. My voice calm, deliberate, and louder than it needed to be, because I wanted every single person at that table to hear me clearly. That I was working on something. You just never bothered to ask what. The pause that followed was heavy with implication, the weight of decades pressing down like a dam threatening to burst. And when my father finally spoke, it was not with the confidence of a man ready to deny or fight, but with the brittle restraint of someone scrambling to regain footing in a conversation he no longer controlled. "You don't understand," he began, voice low and measured. This isn't what it looks like. These things, they're complicated. I had to make certain choices for the business, for the family." "No," I interrupted, my tone sharper now, cutting clean through the layers of denial. "You made choices for yourself. You used me, my work, my name, and you didn't even think twice about it. You thought I'd never find out, and if I did, you thought I'd stay quiet. That's the part you miscalculated." Dany stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech, eyes blazing. "You used her social security number? Are you out of your mind?" he shouted. And it was the first time I had ever seen my brother look at our father like he wasn't sure who he was anymore. "This is fraud. This could get us both in serious trouble." My mother, finally gathering herself, reached across the table, fingers brushing my sleeve in that tentative way she always used when she wanted to seem maternal without committing to the effort. "Jenna," she said, voice cracking, "we can figure this out. We're a family. We don't have to make a scene." I pulled back from her touch, slow but purposeful, and shook my head with a smile that held no humor. "The scene's already been made, Mom. You just didn't notice until the curtain dropped." What none of them knew, and what I wasn't about to spell out at that table, was that the folder wasn't the endgame. It was the introduction. The copies were already sent. The encrypted files were scheduled for release. The reporter had everything she needed, including quotes from me, anonymous sources from within the nonprofit, and enough verification to bury both my father's business reputation and any fantasy they'd been selling about Dany's community work. I wasn't waiting for them to react. I wasn't hoping they'd apologize or try to make things right. I was showing them in no uncertain terms that the rules had changed, and I was done playing by theirs. My father looked like a man trying to solve an equation that no longer added up. He glanced at my mother, then at Dany, then back at me, and I saw the moment he realized that there was nothing left to salvage. Whatever story he had told himself about being the hero of this family had shattered under the weight of my folder, and all that remained was a truth he couldn't control. He opened his mouth again, maybe to plead, maybe to bargain, but I raised my hand to stop him. "You don't get to speak for me anymore," I said, not loudly, but with finality. Then I stood, tucked my chair back into place like a polite guest, and turned to my brother one last time. "You want to fix this?" I asked, looking him dead in the eye. "Start by giving that non-profit back to the community it was supposed to serve. Not to him, not to yourself. Make it real or tear it down. Just stop pretending." I walked out without waiting for a response, the weight of years lifting off my shoulders with every step I took toward the door. Outside, the air was cold, sharp against my skin, but it felt clean, free. For the first time in decades, I felt untethered. Not from my family, but from the version of myself they'd spent years insisting was all I'd ever be. I didn't need their validation anymore. I didn't need their apologies. All I needed was the truth, and I had delivered it with receipts. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't come wrapped in flames, or screaming matches, or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's just a folder, a well-timed truth, a quiet refusal to stay small. And sometimes, if you do it right, revenge looks a lot like walking away from a table that never had a seat for you to begin with, without looking back.